Hey there, before we get started, I wanted to let you know that this week only we are having a sale on my mini course, The Beginner's Guide to Growing Herbs. Regularly $29, you can learn how to grow 11 kitchen herbs from start to finish for only $19 for 1 week. You can watch it at your convenience. Go to journeywithjill.net/herb workshop to learn more about this mini course and to get this discount through May 20th. If you want to grow herbs, this is the mini course that you can go through quickly and learn how to do it right in your garden. This episode is brought to you in part by Garden in Minutes. Whether you're growing veggies, flowers, or herbs like basil and parsley that we'll talk about today, Garden in Minutes makes watering so simple with their garden grid. No more uneven watering or struggling plants, just healthy, thriving herbs and veggies every time. Visit journeywithjill.net/gardeninminutes and use my code JILL for 7% off. Simplify your garden and watch it produce more. You may have heard that herbs are some of the easiest edible plants you can grow, and I'd say that is true. They're also incredibly rewarding, enjoyable, and have the potential to save you the most money on groceries ounce for ounce. So why aren't herbs in everyone's gardens? Well, after having conversations with many beginning gardeners, most of these in person with people I know or have just met, I have learned that while herbs are easy to grow, they aren't always easy to get started. In other words, beginners have questions like, where should I plant them? In a container? If so, what size? What about my garden bed? Should I start from seed or buy transplants? Also, I've found that many beginners don't know which herbs will last only one season and which will live for years to come. And knowing the answer to that question helps dictate also where you grow a particular herb. All of these questions, and we haven't even really talked about which herbs to grow. I know what you're thinking. Didn't I just say that herbs are easy to grow? It doesn't sound like it after what I just shared, but I stand by what I said. Herbs are easy to grow. Once we get some of these basic questions answered and you get started planting your own herbs, you'll see why. In today's episode, I'll share with you my top 5 easiest herbs to grow, but also how to get started planning for them in your garden space. First, let's talk about the easiest herb I believe that you can grow, and that is basil. Basil grows easily from seed directly in your garden. You can just buy a seed packet at your garden center or order online and plant these seeds outside after your average last frost date, after your frost has passed. It also grows really easily if you want to get a head start and plant from seed indoors, and then it transplants easily in the garden. So whether you start from seed or whether you buy the basil transplant at the garden center, it's going to transplant well. So as you can see, take your pick. You can directly sow the seed in the garden. You can start indoors. You can transplant what you started indoors, or you could transplant what you buy at your garden center. All of those are options. And since you can do any of them, then that makes it very flexible for a beginner. Now you may wonder, okay, if I have all these options, which one should I pick? I would say for a beginning gardener, if you are okay with spending the extra money buying a transplant from the garden center, that's probably the easiest thing to start out with. But like I said, basil grows really easy if you just want to plant the seed. The thing about basil too is that it handles the heat really well. It does great in a summer garden, which is perfect for when you're listening to this. If you're listening to this here in May, it's the perfect time for most of us to be planting basil in our gardens, and it will last all summer long. It also can be planted in any space. You can plant basil in containers, in raised beds, and even in ground beds. So any place you want to grow basil, you can grow basil. I've planted it in my regular garden, in my raised beds, in containers, in green stalks. Really, you can do whatever you want. Most of the time, you need to put basil about 6 to 9 inches apart from other plants, up to 12 inches because they can grow pretty large. But as long as you don't crowd them too close together, they will do absolutely great. So here's a tip to plant basil and grow it effectively. Plant it in your garden, whether from seed or by transplant, after the nights are in the 50s reliably in the spring, because they like the warmth. They do not like the cold weather. I've had basil suffer with nights in the 40s. So try to make sure that nights are in the 50s. And then you'll need to prune it aggressively as it starts growing. Unless you're growing a type of basil that doesn't go to seed easily, such as the variety Everleaf, which you can get from Botanical Interest. I grew that last year and I'll be growing it again this year. But unless you're growing one of those varieties, then the thing that you'll notice about basil is it wants to start flowering pretty quickly in the summer. In fact, if you live in a long growing season and you let your basil flower, it'll drop seed and then create a new basil plant before your season's over. But when it does start going to seed, the leaves decline in quality. In order to prevent this and to prolong your harvest, then you want to go in and prune that basil pretty heavily. It can take it, and the more you prune it, the more it will get bushy. Last year in the summer, I recorded a YouTube video about the different herbs that I'm growing, and in that video, I show exactly how to prune basil. So we'll put that link in the show notes if you're interested in that. But that would be my biggest suggestion as you're growing basil, is to keep an eye on it, to prune it. Now, if you want to let it go to flower, it is a bee magnet. Absolutely, bees love this plant, and it's great in your garden. I like to plant basil and just keep maybe one or two pruned really well so that I can have fresh leaves continually, but then I let the other ones go to flower so that I can have a food source for the bees. But regardless of how you grow it, basil is the easiest herb that I would recommend you can grow in your garden. Number 2 is parsley. The reason I chose parsley is because it grows most of the year, and for many of us, it even grows through freezing weather all through the winter, and it can also handle, for the most part, the heat of the summer. It does like a little bit of shade if you get really hot in the summer, but for the most part, I've been able to have parsley grow from spring all the way through the winter to the next season. Parsley is very easy to transplant. So whether you buy a transplant from the garden center or you start from seed indoors, it's very easy to transplant. And if you have a little bit of experience growing from seed indoors, parsley is fairly easy to grow from seed. The only thing you need to know about it is it takes a little bit longer to germinate than other seeds that you might sow indoors, like tomatoes. It's probably more along the lines of peppers, maybe. It takes a little bit longer. It doesn't take as long, in my experience, as celery. So if you've ever grown celery from seed indoors, celery takes a little bit longer. But it's not the easiest. So I don't know that I would start with parsley just because it takes a little bit longer, but you totally can do it. Now, one thing to know about parsley is it is a biennial plant. And what that means is that it naturally will start going to seed the second year. Whereas basil will go to seed the first year, it's an annual. Parsley is a biennial, which means you've got one really long growing season. And then the second year, as long as it doesn't get stressed and bolt too early, which I've only had that happen a couple of times. Most of the time, parsley lasts that whole season. The second year is when it starts to go to seed. So for instance, if I'm planting parsley fresh in the spring, it will give me leaves spring, summer, fall, even into the winter. And then come the next spring, it will start to go to seed. Again, this is okay if you have the room because pollinators love it. And if you plant it in a garden space that you're not specifically earmarking for something in particular the next season, you can let it go to seed and drop its seed and it will create volunteer parsley plants the next year. I have some parsley in a corner of my ground bed, kind of in a pollinator type area, and it continues to self-seed every year. But that's because I don't need that space for anything else. I don't do that for my raised beds just because I'm constantly turning over what plants I'm growing in there. But that gives you an example of what to expect. Now, depending on your zone, it may not actually survive the winter, but for me in 8A, and even when I was technically in 7, it did survive the winter. Regardless, though, it'll have a longer growing season than some of your herbs. It can be planted in pretty much any space. You can plant it in containers or raised beds or in the ground. And as I mentioned before, if you let it go to seed, it can self-sow and you can get more plants that way. Now, here's a tip. I would recommend to harvest it in the early summer because that's when the leaves are going to be their best quality. And then you can let it grow through the summer and then harvest again in the fall. In my experience, when I harvest the second time in the fall, the flavor is a little bit different. The flavor profile has a little bit more of a bite to it compared to in the spring when it's your typical parsley flavor. Now, let me tell you something. If you have never grown parsley in your garden, but all you have done is bought flat leaf parsley at the grocery store, there is no comparison. The flavor is out of this world in comparison to what you buy at the grocery store. I love growing parsley right outside my back door. And if something calls for parsley, I just go and I snip it and I put it directly on whatever I'm cooking. I think the latest thing I did was pot roast, and it had parsley for garnish on the after you're done. And that flavor is just incredible, fresh. Does not compare to what you buy at the grocery store. So this is another reason why I think parsley is a fantastic choice, because it's easy to grow, and also because most of us are using parsley in cooking and it's just so delicious. Number 3 is thyme. Thyme is actually a perennial, which means if it is growing in the right zone, then it's going to last year after year after year. Technically, thyme is perennial down to zone 5. So if you're zone 4 or colder, you may have to treat this as an annual and plant it every year. But for the rest of us, it will last throughout the winter. You can continue harvesting it throughout the winter, although the best quality leaves are in the spring, which is pretty common, spring, early summer. I do end up replacing my thyme plants every 4 to 5 years because after a while, they end up getting a little bit woody and the quality declines a little bit, but that still gives you 4 to 5 years of fantastic harvest. Now, if you're growing it in the ground and it has ample room to creep year after year, you may not have to replace it because it'll just kind of continue growing and giving you fresh sprigs of thyme. But if you're growing it in a container or you're growing it, raised bed might be a little bit like in the middle there, but in a container for sure, I end up replacing it about every 5 years. But the great thing about thyme is that it's drought tolerant. You don't have to babysit it with constant watering. It also is a slow grower. It will eventually spread, whether you're planting in a container, raised bed, or in the ground, but it's not like mint. It doesn't get invasive. And because of this, it can be planted in pretty much any space. You can tuck thyme in just about anywhere. What I love about thyme, and this is a tip, is it's a great companion plant with other herbs that have similar growing needs. This year, when I revamped my herb garden, I have a YouTube video on that we'll put in the show notes. But I planted it with sage and rosemary because sage and rosemary also are more drought tolerant. They don't like to stay too waterlogged. And these are great companion plants to grow in the same space. Herb number 4 is oregano. Oregano is another perennial. It will last year after year down to zone 5. Now, the difference with oregano is that it loves water. It's definitely going to need more water than your other herbs, but it lets you know when it needs it. What it'll do is it will start wilting a little bit when it needs extra water. And I've let it go for way too long, and usually it perks right up. Now, the only time I've ever lost oregano, like lost it as in it died, was this last year. And the reason was because I had it in the same pot for several years. I never did divide it, which means just taking part of it and moving it somewhere else. So it just continued to grow, and basically the whole pot was filled with roots and there was no way I could keep it watered. That happened to my peppermint as well. But as long as you keep it where it has plenty of room, soil, you divide it like several years later. This isn't really a beginner lesson, but eventually you may have to divide it to keep it healthy. It will tell you when it needs water by drooping a little bit. Now with oregano, you can harvest it pretty much any time. I have harvested fresh oregano all year round, but it does provide 2 good flushes of crops for harvesting so that you can dry it or preserve it if you want. And usually that's in the early summer and then also in the fall. The way that oregano will grow is in the summer, it'll create a lot of beautiful leaves. And then it doesn't really love the heat. So eventually when it starts getting warmer, the plant starts sending up flower spikes. Now, this is not the same as basil going to seed or parsley bolting. This is the natural progression of oregano. So as it starts sending up these flower spikes, the quality of the leaves that are there declines. That's why I like to harvest oregano before this happens. And then Let those flower spikes turn into flowers. They're beautiful. They're great for pollinators. And then after those flowers start to fade, then another crop of leaves are going to start coming up from the bottom. And those will be what you'll harvest for the fall. Now, what you'll want to do, just partly because it doesn't look so great, is after those flowers fade, I like to cut off those flower stalks one by one, and then that gives room for the oregano plant to take over and then continue to grow. And I like to harvest it usually after the weather has cooled down a little bit, but I also want to give it about a month or so before the freeze so that it has a chance to rebound before the winter. And again, as I mentioned, you can divide it up after a year or two. I know last year I planted new oregano in my green stalk, and then this year I transplanted into a larger container because it'll continue to spread. And that's the tip I want to share about oregano is because it's in the mint family, it does spread. So I recommend you plant it in a container. I just don't feel like it's probably your best long-term solution for raised beds because it will continue to spread throughout your raised bed. I made that mistake when I was a beginning gardener. And I'm like, I didn't plan on having half of a 4x8 full of oregano. Who needs that much oregano? So that's when I started planting it in a container. And then if you want to companion plant with oregano, that first year, a good companion plant would be annual herbs like basil. You could also do parsley, cilantro, dill. Any of those would be good with oregano the first year because it won't start spreading usually until throughout the season into the next season. So you can companion plant with them that first year. Number 5 is chives. Chives are an herb that anybody can grow. They are perennial down to zone 3. So most of us can grow chives year round. It's a very adaptable plant and it can tolerate partial shade. Once chives are established, they really require minimal care. I don't know that I even do anything with my chives. I just let them be and like, hey, you're on your own. And they come back every year. They have beautiful blooms in the spring. They're actually starting to bloom here. I'm recording this in mid-April. So I think by the time you hear this, they're probably already faded. But depending on where you're located, beautiful blooms in mid-spring. They can also be harvested and you can put them in your salads. You can make chive blossom vinegar. There's lots of things you can do with them. But just like some of the other herbs, they will start spreading over the seasons and they can easily be divided so you can have more plants. Whether you want to just have more plants in different parts of your garden or whether you want to give to other people. But another thing that chives can do is they can be a good companion plant because they can be a good pest deterrent, especially if you plant them along the edges of your garden. For example, if you have a ground bed space, then you might want to put chives on the edges so that they can help deter pests or even rodents. I honestly haven't tried this before, but I've heard good things about planting a perimeter of either chives or garlic to help prevent rabbits. I'm not sure that I would put all my eggs in that basket, but it is an idea for you. But because they spread so easily and because they multiply so well and they're so easily divided, this might be a good way to incorporate some natural pest deterrent into your garden while also adding diversity and having these beautiful blossoms every spring. Now, a tip for chives is to cut them often because this encourages fresh, tender growth. But cut them where you leave about 1 to 2 inches of the chives above the soil so it has that energy to continue feeding the plant so it continues to grow. These 5 herbs aren't the only herbs that I grow. I grow lots of other herbs in my garden. And they are easy for me to grow as well, but they do contain their own nuances. Like how cilantro hates the heat. So most people plant them at the wrong time and they don't realize that that's the reason is they need to be planted at a different season. Or mint, you may want to grow mint and it grows really, really well, but almost too well. So planting in a container is a must. And so with all of these herbs that you might want to grow in your garden, like dill and sage, rosemary, all of these I dive into much more specifically in the herbs mini course that, like I mentioned before, it is on sale for only $19 right now. We'll put a link in the show notes, or you can go to journeywithjill.net/herb workshop. Just taking a quick break to thank our other sponsors. Now that we're past the last frost date, at least in Arkansas, it's finally time to get those warm season crops in the ground. And whether I'm planting tomatoes, herbs, or flowers, I always give my plants a strong start with organic Rev. Before I plant, I mix Rev about 50-50 with water, just eyeballing it, and I dip the root ball into the mixture. It's a quick step that helps reduce transplant shock and encourages faster root growth. I've especially noticed how much better my herbs do when I use Rev. Like basil, thyme, and parsley, they all establish more quickly and they grow full. Rev boosts microbial activity, improves moisture retention, and helps unlock nutrients that your plants need. It really helps plants handle that transition from pot to garden with less stress. If you're prepping for spring planting, don't skip this. Head to organicrev.com and use code Jill10 to save 10% off of your order. I'll have that link in the show notes, but be sure to use the code Jill10 for 10% off. This episode is also brought to you in part by Heirloom Roses, because no garden is complete without a rose. And if you've been thinking about adding roses to your garden, now is the perfect time to plant. Spring and fall are the best seasons to establish roses, giving them time to root deeply before the summer heat or the winter cold. At heirloomroses.com, you'll find over 900 own root roses, plus hundreds of perennials and bulbs to bring your garden dreams to life. Unlike grafted roses, own root roses are naturally more disease resistant, cold hardy, and always true to variety. So you get strong, healthy plants that thrive for years. Whether you're looking for classic favorites or something unique, Heirloom Roses has the largest collection of own root David Austin and Brad Jalbert roses, along with all the amendments, expert tips, and how-to videos to help your garden flourish. So if you're ready to plant, visit heirloomroses.com and use code BEGINNER20 to get 20% off any rose order from March 1st to September 30th, 2025. Again, use BEGINNER20 to get 20% off of any rose order. And as always, the links to our sponsors and those discount codes are in the show notes. Now back to talk about how to get these herbs started in your garden. I mentioned a big question that beginners ask, or maybe they don't ask, but they realize once they start planting that they don't know the answer to this question, and that is where to grow herbs. I mentioned the different options that you may have, and I want to give you some pros and cons to each one. My number one choice is to grow herbs in containers. The reason is because all herbs grow well in containers. At least all the ones that I have tried, they've done very well in containers. With containers, you can control the soil and even the soil mixture. Now, while I don't get too caught up with this, it was something that I considered when I was revamping my herb garden. Again, check out the YouTube video to see all that. But what I did is I had all of these herbs that I wanted to transplant mostly from individual pots to larger planters where I would be companion planting. I bought some wooden planters from Walmart and just kind of wanted to spruce up the space. But I was looking up the different water needs, and what I ended up doing was planting some crops that had similar water needs in the same container, and then I adjusted slightly the container mix. For example, in the planter where I had sage, rosemary, and thyme, I ended up adding some sand to that mixture because I knew that these crops are more drought tolerant and they specifically prefer better draining soil. Whereas the planter that I had lemon balm in, which it loves water, I didn't put any sand in it. I wanted to make sure that it had a soil mix that would retain water for the lemon balm because it's in the mint family and those in the mint family like water. So I was able to adjust the mixture just a little bit. Now, like I said, it's not something that I necessarily really focus on, but it's something that I wanted to do when I was companion planting. And the benefit of containers is that you can do that. Another reason why I love containers is that chances are your containers are going to be nearby, like your back door, your patio, nearby your house, so that you can harvest these crops as you need them for kitchen use. One thing I love doing, as I mentioned with parsley, is if I have a dish that I'm making that requires fresh herbs of some sort, all I have to do is make like 5 or 10 steps and just snip, and I have fresh herbs right there. And if I had them all the way out in my garden where I had to walk a longer way, then it wouldn't be near as convenient. And I've grown basil. I've grown basil out in my garden, and I'm always going to the basil that's close by. It makes sense, right? And then another reason that containers are good choices is because some herbs, like all of your mints, even oregano and lemon balm, they can be invasive. They can take over your space. Ask anyone who has accidentally, unknowingly planted mint in a ground. They realize that they have a really hard time getting rid of it. So to be able to make sure that doesn't happen, you plant those in containers. You also have the choice of raised beds. Now, this is a little maybe controversial because not everybody does it this way, but I want to give you my personal opinion on putting herbs in raised beds. With the exception of mint, oregano, and lemon balm, many herbs grow just fine in raised beds. Now, I don't like planting mint, oregano, and lemon balm in raised beds for the reason I said before when I was talking about oregano, because maybe they won't take over the first year, but the second year, the third year, the fourth year, and that's just the way that they spread. And I don't like it taking over my raised bed because I don't want a whole raised bed full of those herbs. You just don't need them. Another reason why I don't like planting perennial herbs, even ones that don't spread a lot, like thyme, sage, rosemary, in a raised bed is because especially if it's a new raised bed, that soil level is going to continue dropping over the next few years. Now, if you have an established raised bed where that soil has already kind of compacted on its own over the years, you're not going to have this big of an issue. But if it's a new raised bed and you have new soil, as that organic matter breaks down, that soil level is going to start dropping. And depending on what you fill your raised bed with, it can drop significantly. I've talked to a lot of people where this has happened to them, whether it's herbs or even strawberries, and they're like, what do I do? Because everything sank. And then you have a quandary, like, what are you going to do? Are you going to just add soil? Are you going to leave the soil level low? Are you going to try to lift it up, transplant it? I just would rather you not to even have to make that decision. So that's another reason why I don't personally like to plant perennials in raised beds. But that's a personal decision. I just want to warn you, if you decide to do it, you know what to expect. I do like to plant annual herbs in raised beds, like basil. I found that with basil, it'll grow larger in a raised bed because it has more soil, I guess, and more moisture to be able to access. It grows just fine in containers, but I get a larger basil plant when I grow them in raised beds. Also, dill. If you want a lot of dill for drying, for instance, then you're probably going to need more than a container. Like one dill plant will provide a little bit of fresh dill. But if you're going to want to dry dill for, ranch dressing mix or anything that you want to use fresh dill for, you're probably going to need more than one plant. And in that case, you might want to opt for a raised bed. And then this would be the case with any herbs that you want more of to be able to dry. Cilantro, parsley, even when I grow parsley in raised beds, they grow bigger, so I'm able to get more of that to be able to dry and store. But for the most part, they grow fine in containers, but they'll grow a little bit larger in raised beds. Number 3 choice would be ground beds. With the exception of mint, oregano, and lemon balm, all herbs can grow fine in the ground, and mint, oregano, and lemon balm grow great in the ground too. But let's just assume you don't want a whole acre of mint and you're not going to plant those herbs in the ground. What about the other perennials, such as your sage, your rosemary, if it's perennial in your area, thyme? What about those? I don't have a problem with you planting them in the ground. They'll probably do great, but make sure that that's where you want them to be. Make sure that you're fine with them spreading like thyme. Rosemary can grow into a bush. As I mentioned, rosemary's perennial to about zone 7, but I've had it not survive my winters in the past. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But if you're in an area where rosemary will last throughout the year, then make sure you put it in a place where you're happy with it for a long period of time. But if you do that, that's totally fine. It'll probably do really well. Also, another option would be to plant drought-tolerant herbs where your irrigation may not reach. I know many times I've had a corner of the garden where my drip lines just didn't get to. Then the herbs like your thyme and your sage might actually do better there. And annual herbs are always a good choice to go in your in-ground garden. They're great companion plants. Your basil, I will plant basil pretty often in my in-ground garden with my tomatoes. Parsley grows well with that. And cilantro is a great option for tomatoes, even though their seasons are kind of opposite. But these are great options for your in-ground bed as well. Now, the next question you may ask is, should I plant from seed or should I plant from transplant? Now, all of these herbs that I'm talking about today and the ones that I'll teach you about in the mini course, they can all be bought as transplants at your local garden center. But you will pay for them, especially if you buy certain brands. Certain brands are more expensive than the others, so check your different local nurseries. You'll definitely pay more for them. Annuals such as basil, dill, cilantro, plant cilantro in the fall and winter. It's probably too late right now. But those also, they grow great from seed, and it will be cheaper to be able to buy those from seed than to buy the transplants. So I personally recommend that you do annuals from seed and that you do perennials as transplants. Mostly because a lot of these perennials will grow from seed indoors, but they take a long time and they require a little bit of extra indoor seed starting experience. I don't have any problem myself growing oregano, parsley, marjoram from seed indoors. Those are the ones that I'll grow indoors. Chives are also a good option, but I've had years of experience indoor seed starting. So just know if you start them from indoors, they may be a little bit more fussy, partly because they take longer to grow. But for a beginner, I think it's a worthy investment to buy a sage transplant or a thyme transplant, because in most zones, those are going to be perennial. So you're buying one $5 plant, but it's going to last for many years. To me, that's a better investment than buying a $5 basil plant that's going to last you a few months. Whereas you could buy basil from seed and plant them pretty easily. But all of them can be bought from transplants. It's completely up to you, but that's kind of how I look at that. In the mini course, I actually break down all of these options and share with you which I feel like is best, purely when it comes to your money and investment, and also ease of how to plant. After hearing this episode, if you feel more confident about growing herbs now, that is definitely my goal. But if you're ready to actually plan your herb garden and you want step-by-step guidance on what to plant, where to plant it, and how to keep it thriving, and also what to do with it when you harvest and how to know when to harvest, then my beginner's guide to growing herbs mini course includes all of this. It helps you know what are the best herbs for your climate, how many to plant for fresh use or preserving, when to plant, how to companion plant, and how to know what the sun, soil, and water requirements are for each herb. Now, this is always going to be available for $29, but the flash sale that we're doing for just 1 week will only last until May 20th. So head to journeywithjill.net/herb workshop and you can get it while it's discounted. This has been one of the favorite trainings that I have done in the past, and I think this is a great time to do it because this is the time that we want to plant herbs and get them growing so that we can get them harvested pretty quickly. And once you start growing herbs yourself, you will realize that they are easy to grow, and you will realize how much better tasting that they are. And no matter what you do with your garden in the future, if you have busy times where you have to scale back, if you're like me, herbs are never going to be anything you have to scale back because they're so easy to be able to grow and so rewarding. So I hope that this episode has been helpful for you, and I hope that if you need to, then you'll take advantage of the mini course to get instruction on how to make it come to life for you in your garden. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope this has been helpful for you, and I'll chat with you again on next week's episode. Have a great day. This episode was brought to you in part by Garden in Minutes. Whether you are growing herbs, vegetables, fruit, or anything in raised beds, make watering effortless with the Garden in Minutes easy-to-use garden grid irrigation system. The system is put together in literally minutes. Anybody can do it, and you can watch your crops thrive with the even water coverage that it provides. Visit journeywithjill.net/gardeninminutes and use my code JILL for 7% off.